Saskatchewan. Start somewhere inside its borders, pick a direction, and you can drive for hours without ever leaving. A land as vast and varied as its rich history. It doesn't matter where you begin or where you end. It doesn't matter if you're moving or standing still. The place will come to you. It will whisper to you. It will tell you stories. It's a place full of stories. Stories of culture, stories of survival, stories of accomplishment, and stories of people. It will capture your imagination. It will become a part of you. It will move you. Left, right, and center. A fork in the road where the dominoes go. Dominoes, a series of histories falling along a timeline, one event falling into the next, or several into one. Life is also like dominoes, except dominoes in life start here and move into the future. Push one over and there's no telling where it will go. All you can do is hope for the best and hear whispers from the ghosts of the past. They push over the dominoes from history. They push them left, they push them right, and they push them center. And they're telling us what they would do if they were in our place right now.
Well, the idea of enacting human rights legislation originated probably with Premier T.C. Douglas and with his Attorney General, Jack Corman.
In 1947, the government of Saskatchewan made a landmark decision to pass the first Human Rights Act in North America.
It protected basic human rights, the right of free speech, the right of freedom of religion, or freedom of association. It also prohibited discrimination in employment, in professional organizations and societies, in housing, in education. And it was a landmark piece of legislation.
The bill was supported by the CCF government, who endeavored to address the inequalities and discriminations many Canadian citizens faced.
The example that would have been closest to their own memory would have been the treatment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, who were rounded up in 1942 after Pearl Harbor and relocated in camps in the interior of British Columbia and sent off to Alberta and Manitoba to work in the sugar beet fields. At the end of the Second World War, the federal government actually began to deport some Japanese Canadians back to Japan. The Liberals criticized the bill. On one level, they criticized the bill because they believed it didn't protect any rights or reaffirm any rights that Saskatchewan residents didn't already enjoy. At the end of the day, the Liberals gave support to the bill on second reading, and it passed second reading unanimously.
Saskatchewan led the way with human rights legislation. It wasn't until 1 year later that the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The rest of Canada followed Saskatchewan's lead as well.
It certainly did establish a precedent, and other provincial governments and the federal government under John Diefenbaker followed Saskatchewan's lead and passed similar bills of rights. And the culmination of this, of course, is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms passed into law in 1982.
Since its inception in 1947, the Human Rights Act has been consolidated into the Human Rights Code. It now includes equality for Canadians regardless of marital status, age, physical disability, and has added affirmative action.
Left, right, and center. Directions to every community in Saskatchewan. A political point of view, a geographic location, a specific need at a time, and in a place where only one solution presented itself.
Saskatchewan Crown corporations have played an important role in delivering services that have been instrumental in connecting the urban and rural populations of the province. The CCF government of Tommy Douglas made rural electrification a top priority.
The story goes that Tommy Douglas, flying from Saskatoon to Regina, looked down onto the black countryside and saw one or two farm lights. And he said that before he left politics, he wanted to see a light like that in every farm yard in Saskatchewan.
In 1952, rural electrification gained momentum as individual farmers agreed to pay part of the cost of hooking up to the power grid.
The cost to the farmer was about $500 each on average, which is not a small amount in those years.
To help rural customers understand the benefits of the new service, SaskPower sent consultants out to educate rural residents.
Some of these homemakers hadn't even seen an electric appliance, and they were expected to make a selection as to which range they wanted, which dryer they wanted.
By 1961, rural electrification was virtually complete. 90,000 kilometers of wire connected 58,000 farms to the electrical grid. Today, SaskPower operates 15 generation stations and more than 150,000 kilometers of power lines. Another major Crown corporation, SaskTel, can trace its history back to the 1880s.
SaskTel and the province have been together since as early as 1882, when we first supplied telephone systems to Regina.
By 1905, more than 2,000 telephones were operating in the larger cities of the province. 7 years later, Saskatchewan became part of a long-distance network that stretched coast to coast.
It was very important to get communications to the farm. That was essential. And in fact, it's been said that the telecommunications industry was built on the backs of farmers wanting to communicate with each other because they're so far away from each other.
In 1947, Saskatchewan government telephones became a Crown corporation, and in 1969, the Crown became known officially as SaskTel. SaskTel has grown to be an innovative company, a world leader in fiber optic cable and delivery of television and internet service. The company's expertise has been felt across the globe.
We designed and helped install the communication system for the tunnel that goes between England and France. We're presently doing a project in Mozambique, building a wireless network for Mozambique.
Saskatchewan's Crown corporations, including SaskTel and SaskPower, are a big part of the Saskatchewan story. A vast landscape connecting people through technology, roads, infrastructure, and pure innovation.
When the dominoes bring the right idea around, the right thing to do is follow it. Even when others are left standing in the way, writing propaganda upon the eyeballs of those left uncertain, you must center yourself in those uncertain times on the wisdom spoken by the ghosts of our past.
A message from Premier T.C. Douglas. Mr. Douglas.
On January 1st, the people of Saskatchewan and their government will take a forward step toward greater social security. For on that day, the Saskatchewan Hospital Services Plan will go into effect.
The healthcare reforms made by the Douglas CCF government in the 1940s and 50s were unprecedented. Comprehensive health care for pensioners, hospitalization, and free cancer treatment were revolutionary changes. However, Premier Douglas's dream of universal health care for every person in Saskatchewan was waiting for the right moment.
In the late 1950s, the province was enjoying great prosperity. The CCF was looking around for some new dynamic policy to energize the government and the party.
On December 16, 1959, Douglas announced plans for a publicly funded, universally available health plan, Medicare. The provincial election the following year was fought on this issue.
We will need the cooperation of the general public, the doctors, and of our local hospital bodies, and I'm sure that we will get it.
In June of 1960, the CCF government won a convincing majority, and legislation for Medicare was scheduled to commence on July 1st, 1962.
What upsets the doctors in this province is that they see it as state medicine. They believe that their independence as a group is going to be jeopardized.
Citizens groups representing both the government and the doctors emerged. Keep Our Doctors, Free Citizens Association, and the Committee for Medical Care held rallies throughout the province. Efforts to negotiate a settlement with the doctors failed. On July 1st, 1962, Saskatchewan doctors went on strike. The government brought in an outside party to help resolve the dispute.
They actually brought in a negotiator, a member of the British House of Lords, Lord Taylor, to come to Saskatchewan to try and negotiate a settlement.
Taylor, a doctor himself, was able to find common ground between the doctors and the government. The strike ended on July 23rd, when the Cabinet and College of Physicians and Surgeons signed the Saskatoon Agreement. The rest of Canada adopted Medicare in 1967 after seeing how well the system worked in Saskatchewan. Medicare now stands as an important contribution to the Canadian way of life.
After all, this is our hospital services plan, yours and mine. I believe that the people of Saskatchewan are determined to make it a grand success, not only because we need it and want it, but because it will set the pattern for other social security measures, both here in Saskatchewan and elsewhere in Canada.
Left, right, and center. Politics. Dominoes. Ghosts. A direction to the character of Saskatchewan. A means to the characters of Saskatchewan. Ghosts in the present. Every day they push over dominoes from the past. Every day their words, their wisdom speaks to us. Every day they watch us as we push over our own dominoes.
On Kingsmere Lake in Prince Albert National Park lies the monument to a highly influential figure from the early part of the 20th century, Archie Belaney, better known as Grey Owl. As a child growing up in England, he was attached to the lifestyle of Canada's First Nations people.
All his young life, he was just looking beyond the ocean there and had heard about Canada and connected Canada with the wilderness and the Indians that he read about.
Archie immigrated to Canada on March 29, 1906. After a brief time in Toronto, he moved to Tecumseh, Ontario.
He married into the Ojibwe people and lived with them and learned their language and how to live like they did.
He was called the young owl who sits taking in everything. Over the next 20 years, Grey Owl practiced the ways of the Ojibwe while working as a trapper, guide, and forest ranger. In the summer of 1925, Archie met Anahario. The two would go on to build a life together. With Anahario's support and influence, Archie began his transformation to Grey Owl, the author, lecturer, and conservationist.
You can't really tell the story of Grey Owl without including her. She was the so-called woman behind the man.
Anahario talked him into raising orphaned beaver kittens.
He really got attached to them. And just like people, they're all different and they're all part of a bigger system. That's kind of when his life changed over and he went from trapper to conservationist.
His passionate prose and focus on preservation of wilderness caught the world's attention. Grey Owl was hired by the Canadian Parks Branch as the first naturalist in Prince Albert National Park. Through his writings, Grey Owl became well known throughout Canada and Europe. He toured extensively and was an advocate for the First Nations people.
He was a big rock star. Imagine at the time people were lining up for hours and hours and overnight to get tickets to hear him speak.
People were intrigued by the idea of conservation, a concept that was radical for the time. Right up until his death in 1938, tourists made the long trek to Grey Owl's cabin.
People kept writing letters to him for years and years after he had passed away. His books were reprinted and there was a great deal of interest in him again.
He lived apart from the rest of society. He raised many conservation issues and challenged people to look at themselves as part of nature.
He lived what he wrote about. He lived the dream. Because his message is really timeless, he'll never die.
I first heard of Jim Brady many years ago. I remember going to hear him speak at the University of Saskatchewan. It was then that I learned who he was and what he was doing.
James Brady devoted his life to giving a voice to the Métis people. He was a passionate activist, raised to challenge authority.
His grandfather was Laurent Garneau, who was an ally of Riel. So Brady comes from a family history of radical Métis in Western Canada.
Brady excelled in school, but questioned the value of his formal education.
He was of exceptional intelligence and moved rapidly through the school system and then rejected it to be, as he says, amongst the common people.
Brady took a job as a common laborer. It was then that he pursued what he considered to be his real education.
He was exposed to many radicals in Western Canada who came out of Quebec, some from the United States, and he was introduced to the literature and was a voracious reader. His political development and his ideology was all self-taught.
It was during this time that Brady became acquainted with Malcolm Norris. Together they became a powerful force for the Métis.
In the late 1920s, they started to look at the conditions of the Métis people. During the 1930s and the Depression, they set about organizing the Métis people to raise their social and economic standards.
Brady and Norris were part of a group which formed the Métis Association of Alberta. Then, after the war, Brady accepted an invitation from Norris to work for the newly elected CCF and promote reform in northern Saskatchewan.
They worked towards the creation of cooperatives and to provide basic organization amongst the northern people, and that no progress would be made unless they could organize themselves.
Brady and Norris also organized the Northern Saskatchewan Métis Association. They encouraged the Métis to finance activities independently and not accept funding from the government.
Brady and Norris were fighting tooth and nail to prevent what they saw to be political opportunism. In numerous letters to each other, they just said all that's going to happen is it's just going to foster internal opportunism, and you'll never be able to set an independent course.
In 1967, Brady vanished prospecting with a friend.
There are those who think he was killed. There are others who say he was let down on the wrong lake on a fly-in, and he became confused and wandered off.
Malcolm Norris also passed away in 1967.
They both died at a time when federal and provincial governments were really exerting influence over Indian and Métis people. There was a great change going on, and forces were coming down, declaring them to be irrelevant.
James Brady's devotion to helping the Métis and First Nations people in Saskatchewan has earned him a prominent place in the province's history. In 1946, Calgary-born Morris Shumiatcher was invited to take the position of law officer of the Attorney General in Saskatchewan.
He was well known for one of the top 10 criminal lawyers in Canada, and he was very innovative in his practice in that he never did superficial research into any of the cases. He dug deeply, and he frequently took on cases that no other lawyer would take for one reason or another.
Shumiatcher was a dedicated civil libertarian, and while in office, he drafted many forward-thinking statutes, including the Trade Union Act and the Farm Security Act. Shumiatcher also made an indelible mark on Saskatchewan and the world when he drafted the Saskatchewan Bill of Rights.
That was in 1947 that he did the first Bill of Rights, and then the United Nations one came a year or two after, and then the Canadian one in 1960.
Morris Shumiatcher was also concerned with the First Nations and committed much of his time and energy to issues affecting their people.
When it came to be that there was the Saskatchewan Federated Indian College, well then we made quite a large donation to that, because that was certainly one of the things that we believed in.
Shumiatcher's philanthropy also extended to the arts.
He said, "The duty of government to assist in the field of music and the arts is no less than its duty to maintain a fresh water supply or to prevent epidemics. Music, the arts, is no less essential to man's personal well-being than food, raiment, and shelter."
As well as contributing financially, the Shumiatchers have donated much of their time by holding positions in the Norman Mackenzie Art Gallery, Regina Symphony Orchestra, Duke of Edinburgh, and the Saskatchewan Centre of the Arts, to name a few.
It's really up to us. We love it so much that really we should pay for it. And pay for it, I mean in the way of volunteering, attending, and as well any donation, because small donations always add up.
Morris Shumiatcher passed away in September 2004, But the impact he and his wife Jackie made on Saskatchewan will be long remembered.
We can make a difference. Maybe it's small, but we can. And that's one of the good reasons for living in Saskatchewan.
Some people are left behind. Some people are right, while others are wrong. And some people are left out, and they wouldn't have it any other way.
In the 1960s and 70s, the gay rights movement in Saskatchewan began to gain visibility by setting up social groups, community centers, and organized protests. Doug Wilson, born and raised in Meadow Lake, got involved in the movement while obtaining a master's degree in education at the University of Saskatchewan. Since there was no gay organization on campus, Wilson got the idea to start one.
In September 1975, Wilson placed an ad in the Sheaf, and it was just a small little classified ad that said anyone interested in gay organizing, contact Doug Wilson, College of Education, and he gave his box number.
But this small act would cause a huge rift between Wilson and the university.
Immediately after the ad was published in the newspaper, the Dean of Education received some complaints about the advertisement, people being annoyed that he had linked the college with a gay activist group. The Dean felt that this was something that needed to be dealt with in a fairly substantial way, and so he suspended Doug Wilson from supervising student teachers in the classroom.
Almost immediately, a group was formed called the Committee to Defend Doug Wilson. It included both gay and straight students, as well as faculty members and people from the community. The committee held press conferences and rallies to inform the public of Wilson's suspension and asked the Human Rights Commission to formally investigate. The university countered with an injunction to stop the investigation.
The basis of the university's case was that Wilson had not been discriminated based upon gender, but rather on sexual orientation. And at that point in Saskatchewan and elsewhere in the country, sexual orientation was not part of the Human Rights Acts.
The university was successful in stopping the investigation, but Wilson was not defeated.
And so in the short term, it appeared that Wilson's case wasn't successful. In the long term, however, Doug Wilson was seen as a spokesperson for gays and lesbians across the province.
Wilson went on to serve as the executive director of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Association and launched a group called the Saskatchewan Gay Coalition.
He ran as the first openly gay candidate in a federal election campaign in 1988, and unfortunately had to withdraw from the campaign halfway through because he was diagnosed with AIDS.
After a 4-year battle, Doug Wilson died in 1992 from AIDS-related pneumonia. He was 42 years old. To honor his memory, the University of Saskatchewan set up the Doug Wilson Award, which recognizes the work of students and faculty who strive to advance the rights of gays and lesbians. Wilson's work is still an inspiration to people in Saskatchewan and elsewhere.
For years, people were coming up to him on the street and telling him their own personal stories, seeking help with coming out or telling their parents they were gay. Doug Wilson became a role model for young gays and lesbians in that time period.
Left, right, and center. Words. You can form them with your lips, hear them with your mind, embrace them with your heart. You can follow them. You can lead them. You can be them. You can make of them what you want, and in a place in the center of the continent, you can find them.